All right, here we go with objective 7. Um, I found this somewhere and I just thought it was funny. Scissors beat paper. Um, Winston Churchill is going to get the best of Adolf Hitler. But just interesting how that works. V for victory. Anyway, objective 7.1 is America's movement from neutrality to involvement. Here we have SpongeBob and some other dude from SpongeBob, and it says, it's got American hat and allies that says, you trade weapons to the British. Yes? Yes, sir, I do. And Britain is part of the allies. Yep. So technically you're supporting the allies. Makes sense to me. So if you're supporting the allies, I can take out your ships. Unrestricted warfare is uncalled for. We are neutral. It's kind of a funny way how that works. So we have the American Neutrality Acts. Attempts American neutrality in World War II, accidentally wins both fronts. So first off, where did this come from? As World War II was beginning, the Nye Committee was composed in the Senate. And they said that only the merchants of death, which would be bankers and gun manufacturers, made money in World War One. So Congress is now going to try to keep the United States out of World War II by any means necessary. The first Neutrality Act in 1935 is a general embargo or stop selling with warring countries. It also had travel warnings. The next year, 1936, they're going to renew the previous act and added you cannot make loans or credits to anyone belligerent who is fighting. Okay? In the meantime of this, the United States is going to become involved in a civil war in China. So in 1937, renewed the previous acts, no expiration date to this point, ban on travel or sale of articles to belligerents, and it did cover civil wars. So this is all leading up to 1937. Now, World War II has not happened yet, will not happen until 1939, but this is when Hitler's getting very militarized and going through the policy of appeasement, which we'll discuss in class. Now, we have to help England at all costs, is what FDR felt. Now, FDR gave a speech in which he said the United States needs to become the great arsenal of democracy, to speech for the Allies. So in 1939, as World War II breaks out, Congress will pass the last Neutrality Act, but it's called the Cash and Carry. It repealed the previous acts and said we would have armed sales, but only with England and France on a cash and carry basis, meaning they had to pay us cash, they had to take it away. It also banned all travel to Europe. Now, in 1941, as the war is going on and France is folded like a paper bag, FDR wants to introduce a Lend-Lease Act, which is where you would basically give things to people even without the money. And there's some debate in this, and it goes back into other things. But you can see here this cartoon by Dr. Seuss, the U.S. Lend-Lease Dunk Company, 2/3 of the way to England, and then they could take it from there. Now, the end of neutrality has to do with the Lend-Lease debate in which Congress is split. And so you can see here war monuments, Dr. Seuss, John F. Hindsight, master of strategy of yesterday's battles, famed for his great words, we coulda and we shoulda. A lot of people are afraid that if we don't act against Hitler, we could be this whole idea. So the two committees, if you will, first one was Fight for Freedom, which does want to get involved, be interventionist, and they're going against America First, who wants to stay isolationist. Now, the U.S. will make a sink-on-sight policy, and this leads to retribution by Germany sinking the USS Reuben James. The Lend-Lease Act will pass Congress in 1941. So, it looks like we're now getting close into the war. And let's talk about this then. So, with the Japanese, Japan is going to attack Hong Kong and Singapore, both British protectorates. The U.S. will respond to this by making an embargo act where we stop selling oil and scrap metal to Japan. Japan requests peace talks because they need these things. While in the peace talks, you can see the cartoon here. Japan woke up America from a nap, if you will. December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor while people were actually in the United States negotiating peace. And on December 8th, 1941, FDR asked Congress to declare war in a very famous speech that we will definitely look at in class. Now, Objective 7.2. Key people of World War II. America is neutral, says FDR, with Dr. evil things there. America's neutral. I can't do a Dr. Evil. That was bad, wasn't it? All right. So our U.S. presidents that we need to worry about, FDR, he starts the war message, the conferences, and he dies in 1944. Now, Harry S. Truman is the end of the war conferences, dropping of the atomic bomb, and the start of the Cold War. Now you can see here, Truman did not have a college degree. He was not a good farmer. He failed as a hat salesman, but he ended a war by being decisive. So, kind of interesting there. Now, the Pacific Theater. Now, there are 3 theaters or 3 places where the battles are taking place in the Pacific, in North Africa, and in Europe. So we're going to cover Pacific first because after Japan attacks, we're going to try to go. The major goal here, as you can see, the Japanese kind of monstrous claw trying to take Australia, is to keep them from taking Australia. Okay? We have Admiral Chester Nimitz. He's Admiral of the Navy. He developed a plan called island hopping, and we'll map that out on a map in class. But the long and the short of it is we put all of our attention to taking back one island at a time rather than splitting it up. Now, Douglas MacArthur, also here, forced to leave the Philippines but vowed to return to help them. And so he has to flee after they're taken over by the Japanese. And at that point, he's going to try to prevent Japan from taking Australia, which they do. The North Africa Theater, and this is the turning point, if you will. George Patton, very, very famous general. If everyone's thinking alike, someone isn't thinking. General George Patton battled with Germany's best general. His name was Erwin Rommel, or the Desert Fox. Once North Africa is liberated, this leads to Casablanca Conference, which is a decision for unconditional surrender. And that's a decision that's going to ultimately will lead to the atomic bombs, because Japan will not surrender unconditionally. To them, surrender is seen as coward. So, then our European theater, our big Americans, we have General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's the overall commander of D-Day, and there's so much stuff to go there. And General Omar Bradley is commander of U.S. forces during D-Day, and so you can see here. And so we have this idea of safe rooms and exams being canceled for people with this here. And these people in World War II were called the greatest generation because in this moment when they're in the boat, they had to man up, grow up, or get out. And this is, a horrible thing. Many of them 18, 19 years old, and they've been trained, but a lot of them didn't even make it out of that boat, mowed down. So, now African Americans, some important ones we need to know here. Benjamin O. Davis is the first African American general of the U.S. He's the leader of the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen were known as the Red Tails. And we also have this little cartoon here of Dory Miller, who's a hero of Pearl Harbor, much in the same way that we had the Harlem Hellfighter guy that we talked about in class. Now, Dory Miller was a cook on one of these boats, and he ran out and he took a anti-aircraft gun after some people had been shot and killed, and he took out, I believe it was 5 or 6 airplanes. Now, keep in mind, he'd not been trained to do this, but just kind of took up a role. Now, Objective 5.3, new strategies and tactics. And we have this meme of What Does the Fox Say, which was a song many years ago, a stupid song. The guy at the bottom is the Desert Fox, and so what does the fox say? And he would say Blitzkrieg. So we're going to talk about Blitzkrieg. Now, new strategies. Blitzkrieg was Germany's lightning war, highly effective. It consisted of components. The first component would come in with an airstrike of the Luftwaffe, basically taking out air defenses. You would then send in Panzer tanks to take out the bigger things, and then lastly the ground troops, and it was real quick, and people folded really quickly. So much so that now in football, if someone does something unexpected to try to break through the line, that's called a blitz, and this is making back to that. Now, the United States will develop amphibious warfare. U.S. developed tanks that doubled as boats and could be used on land or sea. And so here in the picture on the right is what's called the Duck, or DU. It was DUKW, and now the Ducks are used for tours. You can see that one there is in Boston. Now, in recent years, they have been sinking, so I don't know how much longer that's going to last. But anyway, lastly, island hopping, U.S. tactic to win back the Pacific one island at a time. All right. Now, on D-Day, which is June 6, 1944, Enemy is strong. He may hurl back our forces. Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again. The Allied invasion of Germany, or German occupied France. At one of the conferences, Stalin is really upset because the Americans have not tried to enter Europe. And we had won North Africa, etc., and had the Casablanca, and so the plan is developed to come in and invade in Normandy. When they will, this will eventually lead to the defeat of Germany, and Eisenhower's legacy is built on this day. We have had 3 presidents elected in our U.S. history who have no political experience whatsoever, and that is Ulysses S. Grant for the Civil War, that is General Dwight D. Eisenhower for World War II, and the last one is Donald Trump for his business. That's what he was before, a businessman, so there you are. Now, Objective 7.4 are atrocities, or the horrible things of World War II, and plans to prevent them in the future. If we're going to talk about atrocities, we have to talk about the Holocaust. And so here we are here. This is the front gate of Auschwitz, which says, work makes you free, which is a horrible slogan. But the Holocaust itself was developed by a man named Heinrich Himmler. Now, let's put it this way, okay? Adolf Hitler did not like Jews. He didn't mince words about it. He hated them. But he was a dog on a leash. Himmler released the dog and whatever and had this fire of Hitler and basically threw gasoline on it. Let's say, what can happen? That's the problem. So they do have concentration camps. The largest concentration camp was Buchenwald. Auschwitz was the largest and most infamous extermination camp. And the plan to get rid of the Jewish problem, as Hitler called it, was called the final solution. And they went through various things they did, ultimately resting in this last thing. On the subject of this did happen. There's been a lot of things out there about people denying this ever happened, and that's a horrible thing. And in fact, the reason that the pictures are so graphic of the Holocaust is because people in the 1940s actually thought there'd be someone who come along who thinks it didn't happen. But it did. Now, the Japanese are going to commit an atrocity against the American POWs called the Bataan Death March, or Bataan. After Japan takes the Philippines, these POWs, or prisoners of war, are forced to march to their death. And the Japanese marched alongside them, but they stopped. They were shot, run over tanks, kicked, something. Many of them are killed or died of starvation or heat exhaustion before actually making it to the camp. They basically marched the entire length of one of these peninsulas in the Philippines. Now, to prevent this from happening again, right? At the end of World War II, we have the Nuremberg trials, it's a famous place because Nuremberg is where the Nuremberg laws were made that actually deprived the rights of the Jews of being citizens and wearing the Star of David, etc. Nazis were put on trial for crimes committed in the Holocaust. Many high-profile Nazis committed suicide, but the biggest guy they had right there, you can see him, as Hermann Goering. But ultimately, in the end, he actually committed suicide before he was publicly executed. I think one guy was not sentenced to death, most were, to hanging, and the whole idea here is that we're not going to tolerate this. We want to make a public show, if you will. Similar trials in the far east of Japan, but they did not try the emperor because the emperor is seen as kind of a godlike figure, descendant of the sun, and that would have caused more problems than good had you tried to basically kill their person they adore. Now, how do we try to prevent this in the future? The United Nations will be started, and this is to solve conflicts before wars start. And so you can see right there, the whole idea is peace and security, sustainable development, human rights, and humanitarian assistance. All right? We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Every human has a right that is fundamental there, and it has to be protected. They also have the Genocide Convention. This is going to prevent and punish acts of genocide because the Holocaust was not the first, nor is it the last. And lastly, there will create Israel. They carved Palestine out, and Palestine, which was made for the Arabic people living in or around Jerusalem, and Israel for the Jewish people. And several big problems occurring out of that, mainly in the 60s and 70s, and today, and we'll discuss that as well. Now, Objective 7.5 is the destruction and development of the atomic weapon. Now, in your family, I don't know about you, my wife and daughter are terrified of spiders. And so this was mainly made for me because it made me laugh because there was a spider, I think I got it. Um, but the atomic bomb is no laughing matter, if you will, but let's go. Now, the code name for the developments and testing sites for the bomb was called the Manhattan Project. And you can see here there were so many places. There was a chemical separations building in Washington. There's reactors. There's a gun site in Los Alamos. There's the Trinity site where they test. There's the X10 graphite reactor in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Another couple of things in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. A lot of big things going on in Oak Ridge. You can't. It's pretty close to you. However, you can't get anywhere near this place. Manhattan headquarters in Washington, D.C., and there's a lab in Chicago. All right. The head scientist put in charge of the project was J. Robert Oppenheimer. Now, other scientists were Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein were there. The ultimate testing site was Los Alamos in New Mexico, called the Trinity site. And the military commander, once it was tested and approved, was Leslie Groves. His job was to call the president and say, we have it ready. Now, they actually had as many, I think, 6 nuclear bombs ready to be dropped. Now, Truman's decision, and we're actually going to look at all this in class because there's so much. Groves tells Truman the bomb is ready. Truman decides to drop 2 of them. The first one will be on Hiroshima. Now, this is the bomb memorial. This is one of the buildings that remains standing. And so there's a lot of things there. The second will be on Nagasaki. After that, a week later, Japan will surrender. Now, Objective 7.6 deals with how do we transition from peacetime to wartime materials. All right? So how do you convince companies who are not making anything, we need you to make war? So first off, mobilization is where you prepare troops and supplies to go to war. The big idea that FDR will come up with is called cost plus. The government paid companies to make materials for war by offering to cover the initial cost plus returning a portion of the profit to the company. And so you're going to help me get started, and I'm going to make a profit, and then everything with this profit. This sounds great, and it worked really well. This convinced Ford to stop making the Mustang car and make the Mustang plane, and several other big companies. Now, what do you do with it now that's been produced? 2 big organizations, the War Production Board, told companies what to make, what materials, and how much needed to be produced. For example, let's go back to the planes. They wanted 15,000 planes produced in 1940. Now, if you think about this for a second, 1940, we're still neutral. And so, interesting thing there. The Office of War Mobilization, OWN, distributed the materials to the appropriate organizations so they could be used properly. And here we have some propaganda of United We Win. Now, Objective 7.7, how did the U.S. build a large army? And so again, we have this poor guy here. I can't remember what his name is. Brian. Yeah, that's it. Tries to win the draft lottery. He's drafted into the Army. Not the draft lottery to get Zion Williamson for the NBA or something, but the Army itself. Now, the Selective Service Acts are what they come up with. In 1917, the Selective Service Act is a peacetime draft. They used conscription, which is a draft. When you're 18, guys, you'll get one of these in the mail. This is your draft card, and basically that's your draft number, social security number, etc., if they ever decide to do that. Now, 1940, they will pass the Selective Service and Training Act. This is the largest peacetime draft. Now, selective service is required to be enrolled with all able males on their 18th birthday. And we'll look more into this in class and what all that entails. Now, Objective 7.8 are the wartime labor and rationing practices. You follow the water rationing rules. Please tell me why your lawn is so green. If you live in California, they actually will ration water, and so a lot of, if someone's got a really lush and green lawn out there, it's a big deal. Whereas here in Mississippi, it's not so much a big deal because water is in high supply. I mean, heck, 2 to 3 feet of it fall from the sky all the time to rehydrate our mud. We appreciate that. Now, first thing, you got to conserve food. So do with less, so they'll have enough, is the idea of rationing. Okay, So in order to do this, victory gardens, you must grow your own food. Rationing, you had a stamp book and you controlled the amount of food to be eaten. The idea was that you would have something to serve. Now, price controls. Now, this is my favorite propaganda of all time because if you've ever seen the HOV lane or high occupancy vehicle, it had a car sharing club, and when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. And so you have this ghost Hitler riding shotgun with you. And it's just hilarious to me. Anyway, so the government regulated the price of consumer goods, and they made an administration, the Office of Price Administration, and they actually said what was an acceptable price and what you could not charge more of. Again, the idea is we want people buying things and circulating the dollar, because if the dollar's sitting, the economy is not growing. Now, paying for the war. Both World War I and World War II were financed by the people through a thing called the Victory or Liberty bonds. You would give money to the U.S. Treasury to cover the war, and they would essentially pay you back plus interest. Now, again, a really great propaganda here, right? You see, buy the new victory bonds, and you have kind of the clawful hands of Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan coming after your wife and your kid. And so, how do you do this? You have to pay for the war. They're coming into your home. Great propaganda. Now, we have labor strife, labor problems in the World War II era. A. Philip Randolph, African American, is going to have the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. They're upset about discrimination. They threatened to march on Washington. Ultimately, FDR will pass Executive Order 8802 to end discrimination in the defense industries. And that's a big deal when they come back and they start fighting for actual equality. Now, John Lewis broke with FDR after the Flint Strike. Now, the Flint Strike was a automobile strike in 1937. It was a sit-down strike. There was some violence, etc. And John Lewis is going to break off that. Remember, if we talked about the unions, 1935, he's in charge of the CIO at this point. He withdrew the coal miners' union and went on strike, which is what FDR did not want. The government seized the mine, and in the end, you have all these things come up. Now, luckily, cooler heads did prevail, but there it is. Now, Objective 7.9, the minorities in World War II. So African Americans, A. Philip Randolph planned a march on Washington, made FDR give in. Marian Anderson was a big famous singer, and she was supposed to sing at, oh gosh, what was the name of that place? Carnegie Hall, maybe? And they said she couldn't do it because she's black. So it was arranged for some people for her to sing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Big deal, even bigger deal because it was supported by the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, for common, just kind of run-of-your-mill African Americans, they participated in what was called the WWII campaign. If you remember, we went back, we saw our scissors of Churchill, and that was called Victory. And in England, that became a very peaceful V for Victory type thing, if you will. So it's kind of ironic that was victory, and in the 60s it became peace, which was don't even start. Nonetheless, African Americans said, fine, we have a double victory at home and abroad. And they enlisted in the army to fight fascism abroad and racism at home. So, pretty good idea. There we go. Now, for women, women are inspired by Rosie the Riveter. She's seen here, an American icon. She's a fictional character from a popular song, not based on a real person. And in fact, the real Rose River didn't look like that. We'll talk about that. But women are going to break from traditional gender roles. They're going to take on non-traditional jobs in the factories to try to help the men out. Now, women in the armed forces. Okay. Oveta Kolpabi is the first woman director of the Women's Army Corps. So if you went in the Army, you could be part of the WAC, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, or the WAC, the Women's Army Corps. There was a group in the Navy called the Waves. It is what it is. Women accepted for voluntary emergency service. Coast Guard were called SPARs. I could not find the meaning of that one. And if you were in the Air Force, because they had some sting with them, they were called WASP, or Women Air Service Pilots. And now the WASP never left the country. They did kind of missions around here. Now, Mexican Americans, we have the Bracero program. They brought in the Mexicans to work in the farmers' fields. We have the Zoot Suits and also riots. The Mexican youth are Pachucos. seem anti-patriotic because it went against the idea of conservation of materials. Here you have Jerry from Tom and Jerry modeling a zoot suit, and it was like a wide jacket, very, very long jacket. The pants were very high-waisted. You had a wallet chain. You had a large hat. Um, and you just think about all the material that's taken to be made. All right, it's kind of interesting. Now, the Longoria affair is actually after World War II. Felix Longoria is denied burial at Three Rivers, Texas. Um, Senator Lyndon Johnson is getting involved. Longoria will be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And so that's just an interesting little thing how that works. Now, objective 7.10. We have talked about Japanese Americans because they're in a camp all their own. So internment camps, like the ones for FDR, put the Japanese Americans in during World War II. The internment camps again came up in this whole immigration debate with the border and everything. So let's go on this. Shortly after the war is going to begin in 1942, FDR is going to order all Japanese Americans to go to internment camps. Now, if we say something American, Japanese American, they're of Japanese descent, but they're born here. They're a citizen. Okay? So, they're a citizen entitled to every right, but because of this executive order 9066, they have to leave their home and possessions and jobs and go to these camps. The reason is there's a fear of disloyalty following Pearl Harbor just because of how executive it was. Now, one guy we had was Fred Korematsu. Now, Korematsu refused to go to the camps. He's arrested. He's going to sue the United States in a court case called Korematsu versus the United States. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States, which shocked Fred because he said, hey, this is my rights. The rationale or why they did it, the camps were necessary because of military necessity. They didn't want any other bases being destroyed by people who might have had sympathetic ties to Japan. Now, in the 1980s, Reagan is going to give an apology, an official apology to all Japanese Americans who were children in basic love, and also gave reparations. I think it was $20,000 for any child who went through this. And in 1998, Clinton will give Fred Korematsu, that seen there on the right, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and he will pass away shortly thereafter. But again, we link this case up with the Schenck decision, which we talked about, World War I, the Patriot Act, the Palmer raids, and where you take part of people's rights away in order to feel more safe.